First thing I always do is bring the mic down to a normal level. I notice in the program that I have until 9:15. So just to give you an idea of the planning, about 6 tonight there will be dinner, and we'll be done by 6:30, so I can finish by 9:15. Y'all got that now. I want to thank the USTUR and particularly Sergey for inviting me to do this. And what I will do today is I have a very long story to tell in a very short time. So please bear with me, and I will try to finish by 9:15 tonight, because I am cognizant of the fact that many of you have come from the wrong side of the country, the Atlantic side, and I know there's a 3-hour time difference. Those of you are staying at the Davenport and have walked over to the exhibits. I figured out a way where you only have to go through one time zone to get there. But this presentation today may provoke some discussion, but hopefully that'll be cleared up later in the last session of the day, where the directors, former directors, get together and have their usual discuss things. The emphasis on today will be on the early history, because that's important, and you can see more of it. You're probably familiar with some of it. In any event, as Pat said, and I thank Pat for the nice introduction, the research of the USTUR relies very heavily upon those donors who give what is the ultimate gift. And you'll see some of the things that they have been responsible for with that gift. Well, before the beginning, there was some interaction with the actinide elements in humans, but we didn't know about it. It wasn't until 1789, and there is no truth to the rumor that that was my birth year, a German chemist by the name of Martin Klaproth first identified uranium, which is element 92, and that was the first actinide to be discovered, and of course didn't know it was radioactive. We had had some experience back in the 1700s with the miners in Hohenstahl who developed lung cancers because of the radon and daughter products in the mines, but of course nobody knew that at the time. Plutonium, although its existence and property had been hypothesized for a few years, was not officially discovered. This is the official discovery date, February 5th, 1941, by Glenn Seaborg and his team at the University of California at Berkeley. And prior to that, they had made some discoveries, they had some indications, but that was the day that the realization really occurred. For all practical purposes, plutonium is not found in nature, and the necessity of biological study of both plutonium and uranium was quickly understood in large measure because of the fairly recent tragic experience of the radium dial painters. So from the outset, the Manhattan Project conducted extensive biological and toxicological research with animals, and they published a lot of their findings in a series of books, the National Nuclear Energy Series. I think there's 3 volumes that deal with uranium alone of papers. The realization of the hazards was quick. Glenn Seaborg, then in charge of the Manhattan Engineering District Plutonium Chemistry Research, wrote to Robert Stone, who was the medical director, about the possible hazards of plutonium. And you can look at the slide if you want to read what he said to Stone. But basically the concern was because of the radium dial painters. Radium alpha emitter, similar to plutonium, heavy element. Of course, the dial painters were a great tragedy. Many largely young women, died as a result from typically osteosarcomas, bone cancers, as a result of working under conditions that were okay then with the lack of knowledge, but by today's standards, absolutely deplorable. But Seaborg suggested that 5 to 10 milligrams from the initial half gram, so that's somewhere around 1 to 2%, from the Clinton labs be sent to Joe Hamilton, who was a researcher at UC Berkeley, for biological studies. And a month later, they sent 11 milligrams to Hamilton. Now, this was a very important thing. And here we get into the first human studies with plutonium. Animal studies are nice, but how do you extrapolate from animals to man? If you use dogs, for example, there is a difference. Most people don't have tails. Plutonium concentrates in the skeleton. So how do you account, how do you extrapolate upward? What they did to study the plutonium and the biokinetics, how it moves through the body and how fast it stays in different tissues and organs, they injected 18 people thought to be terminally ill between April 1945 and July 1947. They followed their urinary and fecal excretion of the plutonium for 138 days. It was a very controversial study because of ethical concerns. The information gained, however, led to improved safety standards and hence better worker protection. And you could speculate and say, well, because of the better worker protection, maybe we saved some lives. But here again, we have an ethical problem, and that will come out later in this discussion. But their results were there were no major differences in the tissue distribution between animals and man, except for the liver. The liver uptake and retention half-time were much greater in humans than they were in animals. The retention in the bone, in the body as a whole, was greater in humans than in animals. And that may be in part because the human metabolisms are shorter, also because the lifespan of humans is typically longer than animals. The excretion pattern differed from animals. The human excretion curve was developed by Wright Langham at Los Alamos, who later earned the title of Mr. Plutonium, and he extrapolated it to from 138 days. That's all he had data for, and extrapolation from 138 days to, say, 20 or 30 or 40 years is a risky proposition. And as I say, again, it led to ethical considerations. Pre-USTUR studies began at several places. At Los Alamos, they had the policy of autopsying. It was a closed community. They had the policy of autopsying people who died there in the hospital, and they did tissue sampling. There was also an IPPU club. I can't tell you what IPPU stands for. Not because of security, but because of political correctness. And just joking, IP, urinate, PU, plutonium. Had 27 people who had known exposures, documented exposures, and Los Alamos began to follow those 27 people. Hanford began a modest tissue sampling program in 1949, the objective being to compare plutonium in various tissues, bone, liver, and lung, and then later on they added the pulmonary lymph nodes. And they wanted to compare these tissue concentrations with amounts calculated from excretion data. Rocky Flats began a program in the 1960s and carried it out for a number of years. And they actually did the kinds of things the registries did before the registries. And other groups, the U.S. Public Health Service, the Health and Safety Lab of the Atomic Energy Commission, and many others did population studies of weapons test fallout of plutonium. It always amazes members of the general public to learn that they have plutonium in their bodies. And we all do, but very, very small amounts and difficult to measure because of the small amounts. Well, now we come to the birth of the registries. In July of 1966, the Atomic Energy Commission had a meeting on plutonium contamination at Rocky Flats. It talked about plutonium contamination, not of surfaces and what have you, but of people. In May 1967, so that's about a year later, the Hanford Biology Symposium saw the first report of tissue sampling. And at that time, a registry was publicly proposed by the speaker from the Atomic Energy Commission. And in August of 1968, the National Plutonium Registry was created, quote, to protect the interests of workers, employees, and the public by serving as a national focal point for the acquisition and provision of the latest and most precise information about the effects of the transuranic elements on man. Now that's an interesting statement. It's very broad. You notice it includes workers, employees, I guess there are some employees who are not workers, and the general public. So it's very broad and recognized, I think quite wisely, that there was more than just an occupational problem. And it said the transuranic elements. The transuranic elements include more than plutonium. A contract was let with the Hanford Environmental Health Foundation, which was a private, nonprofit, medically based organization, and W.D. Norwood, Dag Norwood, was named the director. Just a quick word about Dag Norwood, maybe two quick words about Dag Norwood. Dag Norwood walked across the United States in the 1930s. And he would go to meetings, scientific meetings, and on the breaks, you would see him outside walking very, very fast. So that's one thing about Dag. The Dag comes from his middle initial, which was, his middle name was Daggett, first name was William. I never heard anybody call him Bill Norwood, always Dag. And my personal story with Dag was, I was a much younger man at the time, and I was jogging in Richland. There is a beautiful path along the Columbia River, and I was jogging along this path, and I heard footsteps behind me. And I kept on going, and all of a sudden, I'm passed on the left by Dag Norwood, who was then in his 80s. Morning, Ron. Zip. And I think he won a contest in his, a race in his 90s right here in Spokane. They have an annual race for the senior citizens. He also, in his 90s, went hunting and got lost and spent the night in the woods, came out just fine. Dag was a very interesting guy. Anyway, in 1970, they renamed the National Plutonium Registry to the U.S. Transuranium Registry. And that was done to reflect a broader scope than just plutonium. This is a picture of the 1966 meeting. You'll see some people here. I think Roger McClellan, who is a member of the advisory committee, is in that picture. I can never find him in that picture because... Oh, there he is. And also you see Wright Langham in the front row, second from the left, and next to him is Bill Baer and so on. This was the first advisory committee appointed to, it was a blue ribbon committee. Some of the names will be familiar. In the back row, the man on the left is identified as Carlos Newton. He was the first health physics support to the registries. Next to him, Dag Norwood, Bruner of the AEC, Dr. Bruner, and Phil Fuqua, who was the head of the Hanford Environmental Health Foundation. The front row is a name that may be familiar to many of you. On the left, Tom Mancuso. And he was affiliated with one of the most controversial epidemiologic studies I think that's ever been done, where they looked at the health of workers at Hanford and related cancers to their radiation exposure. And next to him, Sterner and Robley Evans, a past president of the Health Physics Society, and Herb Parker. And if those of you had gotten up an hour or so earlier, there was a continuing education lecture on Herb Parker. And you can see Roger McClellan because he attended. And Roger, stick your hand up so everybody knows who you are. And Roger will be very happy to fill you in on what went on. Startup activities, the registries. First thing you've got to do is identify your study population. You also have to establish how you're going to do the work, operational protocols. And they went out and recruited people once they identified them. And so it started up in 1968, but by June 1974, 6 years later, they had identified 5,300 plus transuranium workers. And those were people who were likely to have been exposed or had the possibility of exposure to plutonium. They obtained almost 4,000 signed medical and health physics releases so that they could collect the medical and health physics data. And the idea of the registries was to collect tissues at autopsy and analyze them for plutonium to see where the plutonium went in the body. And 800 people had given their autopsy authorities, and 45 autopsies had already been carried out, 2/3 of these by Rocky Flats, which I said had a program that was kind of a forerunner, if you will, of the registries. And they joined, they were part of the registries, but they did their own thing. The initial scientific findings, the first 14 cases were reported at the Hanford Biology Symposium in '72, and they came out with the conclusion that deposition estimates based on urinalysis were much too high. Plutonium distribution in tissues differed from the ICRP model. The ICRP model was based on plutonium, radium basically, but it was different. The recommended biokinetic models of the ICRP and others were not representative, and that included the Langham model, and needed revision. But the important thing, the bottom line, and this is one of the reasons for the formation of the registries, was that operational radiation safety practices were more than achieving the goal of control of plutonium intakes. So kudos to the old AEC and to the health physics people who carried out those things. Somewhat later, controversy arose. In 1975, Dag Norwood and Carlos Newton, who again, Carlos was the first health physics person. Dag Norwood was a physician. Dag also had an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, so he understood much of the technical stuff very well. And they reported on the results of the first 30 autopsies, which confirmed and extended those previous findings and re-emphasized the need for analysis of all tissues from a single body. They reported causes of death, and there was nothing unusual in that. Sidney Wolfe, who was the physician that headed the Ralph Nader Health Research Group, took exception to that conclusion, and he did his own epidemiologic study. And what he did was a proportionate mortality study. And if you're familiar with a proportionate mortality study, you'll know that this is something that is not the way to evaluate, particularly in a small sample like this. and it created a rather damaging national controversy that lingers even to this day. I'm going to go back to this. The Sidney Wolfe paper was rebutted by Dag Norwood in a letter to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, in which he absolutely devastated what Wolfe had done. And Wolfe later indicated, yeah, he might have been off base a little bit, but plutonium was still the most dangerous thing known to mankind, and womankind too. Well, in 1978, a parallel but administratively separate U.S. Uranium Registry was founded, and it operated on lines very similar to the Transuranium Registry. But recruitment was very slow. By 1991, they had only 32 living registrants. They had done 12 autopsies and had 1 surgical sample. But they had published, at their start, 4 important, very important and useful reports on an overview of health hazards from uranium, including an evaluation of the fuel cycle. In 1989, the founding director of that, I'll call him, Bob Moore, also a physician, retired, and USTUR director Marge Swint assumed the directorship of both registries. They were still administratively separate, and Marge was a physician. And if you want to stay afterwards a little bit till midnight, I'll tell you some stories about Marge. But Marge is a very unusual person. I followed her, and she has a way of looking at things that sometimes I'd walk out of her office shaking my head saying, why didn't I think of that? Because it was just so good. Anyway, we come to the halfway point. By 1992, that's 24 years in, they're 48 years old, the registries, the USTUR had received and analyzed 5 whole body donations, along with a lot more tissues from routine autopsy donors, plus a whole body from a thorotrast case. Now, thorium is not a transuranium element, but thorium is the daughter product of transuranium elements. Thorotrast was interesting to study for the reason that it was used for largely cerebral angiography, ended up in the liver, was the subject of a lot of news media. I think it was 2020 had a big story on TV about it, people dying from their livers being destroyed. There had been a lot of epidemiologic studies, but nothing that really evaluated thorium, or thorotrast is colloidal, thorium dioxide in people. So there were a lot of reasons for this, and a member of the advisory committee, who some of you may have known, the late Chuck Mays, found this case and provided it to the registries. So that was nice. But by '92, the registries had authored or co-authored more than 50 papers in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And just to mention briefly some of them, there was a follow-up of a World War II uranium hexafluoride exposure 38 years afterwards. Didn't find much in them. The 40-year residual plutonium deposition in some early Manhattan district workers was looked at. Again, not much in them, typically well within the control limits that were established. Determined the relationship between the fraction of ash in a bone and the plutonium concentration in the marrow and the bone. Now that's important because plutonium tends to concentrate in the bone and actually on bone surfaces. And how do you estimate after someone has died, how do you estimate what's in the whole skeleton unless you analyze it all radiochemically? And at that time, plutonium analyses were about $400 to $500 each. There are a lot of bones in the body. So it would have been a costly endeavor if you could get the body. They did a plutonium and americium lung clearance study that was interesting. And one of the things that came out of that was smokers as opposed to non-smokers, not unexpectedly perhaps, retained more plutonium in their lungs. It was not being cleared to the lymphatics. Published the results of those 5 whole bodies that were donated and compared in vivo estimates with urinalysis with postmortem tissue measurements. And there was a paper published that looked at all of the current models and found that typically they did overestimate what was in the body. They compared the skeletal distribution of plutonium and americium in man, monkeys, and baboons. That work was done. The comparison, the man was done by the registries. Monkeys were done by UC Berkeley, Pat Durbin, and baboons by Norm Cohen in New York, in an effort to see how the animal models could fit better with the human. They evaluated the diurnal uranium excretion pattern of uranium. I think many of you may be familiar with the simulated 24-hour urinalysis. And I'll speak to this. I'll pat myself on the back. I think Tim Lynch might be in the room. Tim was a graduate student of mine, and we wanted to check and see if the simulated 24-hour sample was actually just that. And we collected, we set up an experiment to do that and also look at uranium in urine. One of the things that shows how sometimes people, well-meaning regulators, can be a little overzealous, when we submitted our research proposal to the committee that reviews these kinds of things, they kicked it back. They said, "What is the risk of the study?" Well, we were just collecting urine from a number of healthy males. In fact, I was one of the study subjects. And we used plastic bottles, so if they dropped them, there wouldn't be a breakage and so on. There had to be a risk. We could not think of any risk. And we went back and forth, and finally I said, okay, I'll come up with a risk. And the risk we came up with was one of the study subjects in a public restroom in the toilet stall, dropping his container of urine. And when he exited the stall, he slipped on the wet floor and fell. Zipped right on through, and we did the study. The first whole body donation was case 102, was a chemist at Lawrence Livermore Lab, and he had a wound that was found at autopsy with americium, and it revealed an interesting systemic deposition, 82% in the skeleton. The model would have predicted somewhat less than that, and somewhat more in the liver. And from that, on the right-hand side, the picture shows that the only half the skeleton was analyzed. That was usually the way it was done. Skeletons are pretty much bilaterally symmetrical, and there were 4 phantoms made for whole body counting evaluations. And a special issue on the left was published in the Health Physics Journal. Well, all was not sweetness and light. The USTUR was under siege. The 80s and 90s were marked by allegations regarding the legality and ethics. The media, including 60 Minutes, General Accounting Office, President's Commission on Human Radiation Experiments, there were lawsuits, charged body snatching, false reporting of results, failure to obtain releases for medical and exposure records, failure to follow the Nuremberg Code on human subjects. No investigation, official or unofficial, has ever found any evidence of USTUR noncompliance with legal requirements or any ethical violation of wrongdoing, either willful or accidental. So I think it's been a well-run program, and I greatly respect those who preceded me. Well, the watershed was the move to WSU, and it was largely a response to the allegations of impropriety that went on, and an undercurrent that the registries were slow in publication, etc. WSU got a very large grant, Washington State University, and took it over. I remember I was the director then, and I got a phone call one day from shortly after the move to WSU, from a newspaper reporter in Seattle. And he wanted to know about this body snatching that we were doing and so on. And I said, body snatching? What do you mean? I said, the university wouldn't permit that. He said, what university? I said, Washington State University. He said, oh, I guess there's no story then, and he hung up, and I never even got the guy's name. So the DOE, much as I hate to say anything nice about the DOE, understand, but the DOE actually made a very wise move in that, at least from the standpoint of mollifying the press a little bit. Well, here's the genealogy. And you can see the registries were formed. You can see analytical support, we call it, came out of Rocky Flats and for a while Pacific Northwest Lab. Then later on Los Alamos took it over. And now it's all done as of 1992 by the College of Pharmacy at Washington State University. Just a list of the directors, nothing spectacular there. You can see what's happened to the budget between 92, the year that it went to WSU, and today. WSU reviewed every registrant file twice to ensure that the permissions and medical and health physics records were on file, microfilmed the database, so there were 2 copies, one stored in a library in case the building the registries was in burned down or flooded or what have you, documented their administrative policies and procedures in a series of procedures, actually, and updated the electronic database capabilities. Computers were a great help. Pathology slides and blocks had been collected but had never really been looked at, and these were organized. And one thing that helped was the addition of a labor representative to the advisory committee, because this program was being done for the workers, as you saw in that early statement, and their input was important. A lot of registrants had not been traced. They had been lost. They'd signed up 25 years later. Where are they? And that was done. There were expanded program responsibilities. The USTUR acquired the old tissues from Lanel and from Argonne National Lab, the radium dial painter tissues, to create the National Human Radiobiology Tissue Repository. They also acquired from Pacific Northwest National Lab the National Radiobiology Archives, which were animal study results, all the lab notebooks and so on, and that was transferred to Northwestern University, where it now resides. The WSU era continued and expanded basic scientific efforts and increased productivity, added adjunct faculty and graduate students, more bang for no buck. The adjunct faculty didn't get paid. Graduate students, you know, are the cheapest form of labor, and that was good. Collaborations were expanded, foreign, and so on. I'm just going to mention in about 15 seconds the Atomic Man, that's case 246. There's a few quick things here, but if you just look at the bottom of this slide, it's going to be the next paper by Gene Carbaugh, and you'll learn all about this man who suffered an enormous intake of americium. Our Thoratrast study enabled us to find alpha risk coefficients for liver and skeleton leukemia, and validate one, shoot down one, and shoot down two actually. One was too big, one was too small, that were obtained from the epidemiologic studies. And for the first time ever, we looked for a gene, the CFMS gene, and it was interpreted as being possibly radiation-induced. And there's what Thoratrast looked like. Uranium in man, looked at the environmental uranium in 3 whole body donors and found some interesting differences from the ICRP model and from the reference man values. The skeletal deposition fraction was only 14%, very much different than plutonium and americium. And the skeletal residence half-time, for example, was 13 plus years as opposed to the 4 years recommended by the ICRP. Academic outreach, you'll hear from Sarah later today, I think, but there is now involvement with undergraduate students and master's and PhD students. Our publications over the years, on the you can see the number of publications per year over the years, and I'll quickly point out that there have been 198 documented by the Web of Science, and they said 165 have been cited. The total number of citations, almost 2,500, but the average number of citations, about 15 per paper, with an H-index, if those of you are familiar with it, of 27, which is pretty good for a small study like this. Contributed to various NCRP reports. There's one on there that was omitted, and also to ICRP reports in the form of being referenced. The NCRP reports, actually one of our staff members actually chaired a committee on. So where are we going? Let's wrap this all up because it's close to the witching hour. The registries are piecing together the biokinetic puzzle. Through continued refinement of biokinetic constants and other data, reference man data for the actinides, which lead to more accurate estimates of people while they're alive, in vivo estimates. They validate and provide refinements to the established models to ensure their adequacy. That's where we're going. We've been going this direction for a long time. But there are new things. There are greater support of students and additional collaborations on an international basis. You can see where the registrants are. I think there's a slide missing out of here. Well, in any event, there are expanding horizons for the future. Looking at refractory plutonium oxide cases, the long-term deposition in the lungs, soluble plutonium from those UPPPU cases, plutonium in wound, and these are the number of cases that we have. Here are the expanding horizons. That should have been sooner. But you can see the kinds of organization with whom collaborations have been established. I can't read, I don't have a pointer, but I can't read that one on the right that's, got the atom thing with those funny letters. And Sergey, you may want to translate that. And finally, a look at the crystal ball. I'd like to see, and I think it's going to move in this direction, linking of chemical and radiation exposure data and bioassay data to see if maybe we can't separate out the effects of the various insults and see if combined insults work worse than non-combined, etc. Look for cytogenetic studies for biomarkers to determine disease origins in these tissues. We, when I say we, the registries would not necessarily do that, but they have a wonderful tissue base that's unique and could be utilized by others. Other elements such as beryllium can be studied with these same tissues, and I see an expansion of tissue banks to provide additional support for collaborative research and increasing student support and perhaps even sabbaticals for staff. I'd like to acknowledge the support and assistance of the director, current director, Sergei Tolmachev, and other members of the USTUR staff. And here's a picture of them. All I can say is they helped prepare these slides, otherwise they would have been illegible. But thanks to their help, I think they're pretty good. You can see them. And I thank them all. I couldn't have done it without them.